In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill. We've got a fascinating show today, dedicated to the supposed genocide commands in the Old Testament. And, it's really become a more popular issue recently due to the rise of the new atheism, I think. Richard Dawkins thinks that Yahweh is the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. And so is it true that Yahweh is just this mean, vindictive God? After all, he commands his people to utterly destroy everything. So let me read a couple passages here to you. So 1 Samuel 15, now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. And then also in Joshua, you see this command often. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, and the Negeb and the lowland, the land and the slopes, and all the kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel commanded. So that's Joshua 10:40. So here you have this difficulty, because if Yahweh is all loving, why is he telling his people to go to war, but really a severe form of war, really genocide, killing women and children? I think that's really the heart of the issue. Chris, I know we've talked a little bit about this. This has been an issue perhaps that is a difficulty for Christians. Yeah. Have you encountered it in your thinking, your studies at all?
Yeah, I think it's something that every Christian wrestles with. It kind of, I think, is attached to the problem of evil a lot. And then, obviously, like you said, opponents of Christianity, this is the first thing they cite is, well, like if the God you're preaching is this God in the Old Testament who seems to be angry and vindictive and petty at first glance, and just as a bully, I don't want anything to do with him. So
right.
Having a proper understanding, I think is super, super important.
Yeah, so this is right up in the apologetic alley, because if you interact with anybody who's a non-believer, there's a good chance you've probably heard this. If someone's a new atheist, especially if they've read Dawkins' God Delusion, I think that really brought it to the forefront. Okay, so before we get into that, though, I've just got a few points here of business. We're trying Facebook Live for the first time here for Veracity Hill. We've got that rolling. So if you are if you like our page, Veracity Hill, you'll see it come up likely in your news feed. And today we're just going to be doing sort of the introduction here, and we haven't yet figured out to see if we can input the guest sound. So we'll be working on that. So we're taking baby steps, as I've told Chris, and we're gonna figure that out. But today also we've got a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Paul Copan on this topic. And so for those of you joining us here on Facebook Live, if you want to continue on after we end the live stream there, go ahead to our website, veracityhill.com, and you can listen to the rest of the show. So thank you for those that are presently live. I appreciate your support. Okay, so we've got this pre-recorded interview. If you have questions, though, Chris and I are still going to be taking your questions after the interview. So if you want to have your voice heard, feel free to give us a call. The number is 505-2STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. So go ahead, give us a call if you've got a question or comment. We'll be taking those after the interview with Dr. Paul Copan. Now, you might be asking, who is Paul Copan? Well, he is a professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and he holds the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics there. And he has edited, co-edited, authored, co-authored something like over 20 or 25 books, just a lot, some some good philosophical work, but also some stuff for us not so philosophically minded. He's written some great popular level books. So I've liked When God Goes to Starbucks, A Guide to Everyday Apologetics. One of the first books I ever read on apologetics was True for You But Not for Me, Deflating the Slogans That Leave Christians Speechless. And so it was literally the very first apologetics book I read, and it's on relativism. It really helped me understand what people were saying in high school. That's when I first read it. So I'd highly encourage you to get that one. He's written some other books as well, Loving Wisdom, Christian Philosophy of Religion. That's just your interpretation, responding to skeptics who challenge your faith. So he's really a prolific apologist. He's a great philosopher as well. And so I had the pleasure of interviewing him just yesterday, actually. He was able to block some time in his schedule, so I decided to capitalize that and recorded the interview. Again, if you've got any questions or comments during the interview, we've got the phone lines open, so you can go ahead and give us a call, and then we'll be taking those after the interview. So I hope if this has been something that's really been a difficulty for you, maybe you've even found yourself doubting the Christian faith because of these passages, we're going to be taking an interesting and, shall I say, untraditional approach. And what I mean by that is I never heard of this explanation up until just a few years ago of how to better understand the biblical text in its historical context, because we really need to understand the passages of Scripture in their historical context. We need to remember that these Bible verses were not written to us. They were written to a different people from a different time with different values. But the Scripture was written for us, because when they wrote it down, they had hoped that the writings would continue on and live on. So the biblical text was not written to us, but it was written for us. So with that in mind, we need to understand and we need to interpret the text in light of its original intention. So how then should we understand these difficult passages in the Old Testament? So for this, I'm no expert, so that's why I bring experts on the show, so they can handle these difficult questions for us. And so I'm going to play the interview here, and I hope you enjoy the show, and we'll catch you after the interview. And also, let me say thank you to the Facebook Live followers. We're hoping to start doing this, so thank you so much. I'll be catching you another time. Dr. Copan, thanks for joining us on the show today. Today we're looking at the supposed divine genocide commands, and you've written a couple books here. Is God a moral monster? Did God really command genocide? So what is it about a philosopher that is interested in the Old Testament?
Well, I do have a background in biblical studies, both from my undergraduate days, and I majored in biblical studies, and also in my master's level, I have a Master of Divinity degree, and so I did biblical and theological studies in seminary. And so that's a bit of the background, and so hence my interest in these Old Testament matters in particular. It became more pronounced with the event of September 11th and the aftermath of new atheists who were engaging in the basically dismissing and trashing the God of the Old Testament as being mean, vindictive, cruel, barbaric, and so forth. And so I just wrote an article in response to some of these charges of the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, etc. And then that developed into the book, Is God a Moral Monster? And then beyond that, Matthew Flanagan, who's an excellent theologian, philosopher, joined me in the second book, Did God Really Command Genocide?, in which he in particular tackles some of the philosophical issues related to the divine command theory. And so anyway, that's a brief sketch of the development of that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I imagine there might be some people wondering why is it that philosophers have gotten interested in this. Even I've come across an article by the philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, who's also I guess it was a chapter of a book called Reading Joshua. So even it's piqued his interest as well. Perhaps for the same reasons that got your interest. So we've got this text here in the Old Testament. I guess we have multiple texts, right? Multiple passages. And the passages talk about, I think the main thing that bothers some people, it comes across as repulsive, is the idea of killing everything, wiping it all out, including the women and the children. I think that, if I had to boil it down to one specific point, I think that's the issue. So for some Christians, I guess traditionally the argument has been, well, God is the creator of life, and he's also the taker of death, and so he can do what he wants. And so if God wants those people to die, he's God and we're not. So now, is there merit to this argument, and does this view take the best view of the best interpretation of the text?
Well, there are a number of layers to which that we need to consider here, and there are philosophical, biblical issues at play here. Mm-hmm. But let me begin to unpack them. Yes, this is seen as an exception to Israel's normal warfare code, which does distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Mm-hmm. So this is an unusual situation, and the text acknowledges that this is unusual. It's not as though this is how the Israelites are to engage with all the nations, but as they're engaging with the Canaanites. Remember, even here, it's not anything ethnic. It's not anything tribal. It's simply a matter of the wickedness of people who are engaging in acts that would be considered criminal in any civilized society. Incest, bestiality, ritual prostitution, infant sacrifice. Those are the sorts of things that are on a much different level than, those people have tattoos and we don't, or those people eat pork and shrimp and we don't. Right. A far different consideration here. So that is something to keep in mind. Also, we understand this in the context of a group of peoples who have been degrading over a long period of time. When God spoke, for example, to Abraham around 2000, 1900 BC, you have his telling Abraham in Genesis 15:16 that he's going to wait until the sin of the Amorites, a Canaanite people, would be filled up. So what is this looking like? Well, this is basically half a millennium before the Israelites would actually come into the land of Canaan, and this would include 430 years of Israel's being in Egypt, including slavery. So this is not something that is precipitous, something that has been just a dramatic new development. No, this is something that has been going on a long time. Furthermore, you also have a Canaanite people who are aware of who this God is and what this God did in the land of Egypt. Rahab in Joshua chapter 2 speaks of the awareness that all the Canaanites know, and our hearts melted with fear when they heard about what your God did to the Egyptian gods and how you came through the Red Sea and so forth, what you did to the Sihon and Og and so forth. And so you have that. You have also these Canaanite kings in Joshua chapter 5 who know that, wow, this is the God who brought them through, the Jordan on dry ground. And this is and then in the Gibeonites in chapter 9, they are aware of what God did in Egypt and so forth. And then even you get to 1 Samuel 4, when the Israelites are battling the Philistines, and the Ark of the Covenant comes into the camp of the army of the Israelites. Then the Philistines are greatly afraid because they said, these are the gods who brought them out of the land of Egypt and so forth. So there's a pervasive awareness of who this God is, of what this God has done. Not to mention that there's a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night over the camp of the Israelites. So it's not as though you have a command that is given that is a private revelation to Moses or Joshua, and then no one else can really verify this, but we'll just go ahead and attack the Canaanites anyway. No, it's much more pervasive and public than that. And so you have public signs and wonders that are accompanying this command. The Canaanites have ample warning that this is the God who is greater than the gods of the Egyptians and so forth, and there are signs and wonders that go along with this. So it is an unusual circumstance, but it's also accompanied by one, these signs and wonders. Secondly, there's a long period of time that is taking place. Thirdly, you have something very strange going on with regard to the language of utterly destroy, leave alive nothing that breathes, and so forth. Mm-hmm. In Deuteronomy 7 as well as Deuteronomy 20, you have that sort of language. But then you keep reading, and where you read places where it says, we utterly destroyed them, and then you find out, actually, there are a lot of survivors. There are a lot of people who allegedly were wiped out, and there they are back at it again. We can talk about the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, where they had just attacked. They'd been raiding the Israelites in 1 Samuel 14:48, and then we read in chapter 15, God says, utterly destroy them, man, woman, young, old, etc. And then we read that the narrator is telling us, actually, not just Saul who tells us this, but the narrator tells us that Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But then we read later on in chapters 27 and 30 that David is fighting against a whole slew of Amalekites. So often within the same book, sometimes within the same chapter, or even sometimes the same verse in Joshua, we see that there is, on the one hand, language of utter destruction, and then we see, on the other hand, lots of survivors. So that is also another consideration. What does this term "utterly destroy" mean when you look at utterly destroy in the ancient Near East? These terms of utter destruction, leaving them, without survivors and so forth. This was staple language in ancient Near Eastern war texts, where you could have maybe a narrow margin of victory or even a loss and declare that you had utterly destroyed your opponent. This is something that has, that happened with, Ramses II, who talked about this battle against Syria at Kadesh, and he basically said he was, the king was alone standing, or the Egyptians alone were standing, and no one else was around. And he talked about in terms of millions of people and all the nations that he's fighting against. Well, you actually, when you have that kind of language, it is, and then you see what actually took place, that it wasn't even, decisive victory, if that. You keep on reading that there's a lot of that kind of language in the ancient Near East. Moab, for example, King Mesha is, in his, he battled in the 9th century BC against Israel. He said, Israel is no more. Well, actually, that was over a century premature before the Assyrians actually came in and devastated the northern kingdom of Israel. So that's the sort of thing that you have going on. You furthermore have another complication of the language of driving out the Canaanites. You have this language of those who are supposed to be driven out. Well, if you're driving them out, you're not killing them. You are not literally, utterly destroying them.
You're not hunting them down. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we put all of these things together? Well, I think you do have two stages or two phases. You have, on the one hand, you have the phase of driving them out, and this is the primary command. This is the predominant command, to drive them out. So it's not directed in any way toward genocide. For one thing, there is no ethnic hostility here, no tribal hostility, because a lot of these people who are mentioned, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Hittites, and so forth, these are often, included in the people of God. There's a kind of they're friendly terms. Rahab was a Canaanite. Caleb was the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, one of the peoples mentioned in Genesis 15 when God is talking to Abraham. The Kenites. You have Moses' father-in-law, who is a Kenite. You have Uriah the Hittite, and so forth. Who is one of David's mighty men, and so forth. So again, there's nothing tribalistic, nothing. There's no real ethnic issue here. It's more a matter of wickedness and engaging these sorts of activities. So even there you have a kind of a nuanced understanding of what's going on. There is no ethnic cleansing at issue here. But you do have the driving out component, and that is the dominant command. On the other hand, if people are, they're entrenched, they don't want to leave, then they're going to leave themselves vulnerable. They're going to be open to attack. And so that's where the men, woman, young, old, etc. comes in. But typically, when you're fighting, you're not going to be dealing with the, women and children and so forth. They're going to be the first ones to flee. Typically, that's just how battles work. That's how fighting works. But it's also interesting that even the commands to utterly destroy presuppose that there are going to be Canaanites around. In Deuteronomy 7, when it says, utterly destroy them, leave alive nothing that breathes, show no mercy, and so forth, then it goes on to say, and once you have defeated them, utterly destroy them. Okay, and then it goes on to say, and then basically don't make any covenants with them, don't intermarry with them, right. don't make these alliances with them. In Deuteronomy 7. Well, what's going on here? It seems like there's a kind of a mixture of language of utter destruction and then how to deal with the people in the land. In fact, the more you read in Joshua, we utterly destroyed them. And then you keep reading, but at the end of the book of Joshua, even though the land has had rest from war and so forth, you read at the end of the book that there are many nations that still remain and that need to be driven out. In the next book, in Judges 1 and 2, we see repeatedly they could not drive them out. The Israelites couldn't drive out the Jebusites or whatever. Even in 1 Kings, it's kind of interesting. Even in Judges chapter 1, you have first of all mentioned that the Jebusites who live in Jerusalem, that the city was burned with fire, that they're utterly destroyed, and then later on you read that the Jebusites are there to this day. So again, you'll have these sorts of tensions, and if you take them literally, contradictions. But if you understand the ancient Near Eastern context where utterly destroy does not seem to mean literally utterly destroy, it starts to come into focus. Furthermore, something that adds another layer to this is that as you see the Israelites going into the land of Canaan, they're engaging in what Kenneth Kitchen, the Egyptologist, says is more like disabling raids, that they're raiding these towns, typically military installations, according to the Old Testament scholar Richard Hess, that these towns are more like military installments, places where the religious and military leaders are, but generally not for the civilian populations. And so they're going in there, they are disabling them, they're incapacitating them, but they're not occupying these towns. They're actually going back to their base camp at Gilgal. So there's this interesting kind of a slow, gradual process that is also unfolding, that it's not this military blitzkrieg, this sudden incursion into the land and taking over vast swaths of Canaanite territory. No, you have actually more like gradual infiltration, back and forth battling, people who are entrenched and not being able to drive them out and so forth. This is a process that takes a couple of hundred years until the name of Yahweh becomes the dominant national deity in that territory. So again, this is a long process, and it's interesting too that Joshua, we're told, is doing all that Moses commanded. But if that language from Moses in Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 20, utterly destroy, leave alive nothing that breathes, show no mercy, etc. Well, you've got Joshua who is allegedly obeying everything, but yet you have lots of survivors. So it seems like the language does not even presuppose utter destruction. You don't have this annihilation that often comes to the mind of modern readers.
Sure.
And I would say that that's the same sort of alarm bells go off in our own day when we talk about the mention of slavery in the Bible. Our minds automatically go to the antebellum slavery in the South. That is what the Bible means by slavery, and I think that that's just an unfortunate translation of the Old Testament, which I'm not going to go into at this point. But
there's cultural differences there, yeah.
And translational differences in some ways too. So cultural as well as with regard to the term slave. I think just
right.
You don't translate with this kind of loaded language. You have to more qualify how you're translating rather than just kind of throwing it out there and not really qualifying that kind of emotional language or the alarm bells that go off.
Right.
But anyway, going back to the the question. Well, what about again we talked about women and children and so forth. But let me step in and offer some philosophical reasoning here. We've looked at some of the textual issues, but I think that as we want to really hit this head on, it's important that we distinguish between certain categories of duties. A lot of people, when they look at the Bible or just duties in general, they think, they're all absolute commands. They're all utterly unqualified, absolute, no exceptions sorts of commands. But that's actually not how things work. There are absolute duties in Scripture to worship and to love God. That's no compromise there, no qualification, etc. Don't engage in idolatry. Again, these are commands, these are duties that should never be violated. But that is different from other duties, which would be more general, or philosophers might call them prima facie duties. For example, it's generally wrong to deceive other people. Mm-hmm. But it would be permissible in warfare or criminal activity to deceive. So, for example, you have Rahab or the Hebrew midwives, or even God himself when he tells Samuel when his life might be under threat by Saul when he's going to anoint a new king. God tells him that if anyone asks you why you're going to Bethlehem, 1 Samuel 16, this is the Lord speaking, by the way, 1 Samuel 16, if anyone asks you why you're going to Bethlehem, tell them that you're going there to offer a sacrifice. So here, there's deception going on, but innocent life is under threat, and so deception is permissible. Of course, we deceive quite often when we leave our lights on when we go out at night to give the impression that someone is home when actually that's not the case. But also, I would say that there's another exception where it would be morally there. In general, the command "don't take innocent human life" would be understood as normative, etc. All things being equal, you don't do that. But is it possible that there are overriding circumstances in which it would be morally justifiable to take innocent human life? Well, here's an example. An ectopic pregnancy, that is when a fertilized egg is trapped in the fallopian tube of the mother rather than being implanted in the uterus. And if the unborn, the little one, I believe in the sanctity of human life from conception onward, that this is a human life, but it would be morally justifiable to take that life in order to save the life of the mother. Otherwise, both the unborn and the mother would die. And so we're not saying, this is a good and pleasant thing. No, we're saying it's a tragedy. It's something that we don't desire to happen, but we could give another example too of during a terrorist attack and a plane is hijacked by terrorists and the plane is going to be used as a weapon of mass destruction,
right? And
a president or prime minister says, "Shoot the plane out of the sky." Yeah. Well, that would be a morally justifiable action, even though it would result in the killing of innocent men, women, and children on board that plane. Again, tragic. Again, we done with great reluctance, but still morally justifiable.
Yeah.
So we have, on the one hand, absolute duties. Then we have general duties, but then we have exceptional duties in these cases of supreme emergency when those general duties may be overridden. So it's not as though morality is being turned upside down, and generally speaking, you don't take innocent human life. Generally speaking, you don't deceive and so forth. But there may be, again, certain circumstances that, in which those duties would be overridden. And again, even the scriptures themselves suggest that those duties may be overridden. So we're not talking about God commanding something that is evil, but rather God commanding something that is difficult, but would be, in certain instances, morally justifiable. So if we can talk about innocent life being taken in certain morally justifiable circumstances, how much greater confidence can we have that God, who is commanding this, has morally justifiable reason for permitting this? And again, this is only stage 2 of the offensive, that the primary command is to drive out people, which again suggests that people survive.
Sure.
If you're driving them out of the land, clearing away the land so the Israelites can receive the gift of the land that God has promised to them, then this is something that is that you're not killing people. David was driven out of the presence of Saul. Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden. Again, they weren't killed. They were just driven out. And that's the predominant command. And we ought to focus on that and not lose sight of that. So God is not going to command something intrinsically evil. If God is, some people say, because God is necessarily good and wise, he couldn't command the killing of the Canaanites. Well, maybe what we can say is this, that if, for one thing, if a command is intrinsically evil or impossible, God won't command it. But because God is necessarily good and wise, he would have morally justifiable reason for issuing this command regarding the Canaanites. So again, I think some of those philosophical issues can have a bearing, can give a fuller picture of what is going on here in this scenario, and to make better sense of this. Now, I know that there's an objection here.
Yeah, I've got some follow-ups.
And maybe if I might just take the liberty, I'm doing a lot of talking. I'm kind of on a roll here. Thanks for putting up with me here,
sure,
Kurt. But
what's the anticipated objection?
Some people might say, well, what if a terrorist claims, well, God told me to blow up a bus full of children, and that's often used. What about ISIS today, and so forth? Well, let's unpack that a little bit. For one thing, a person sincerely believing that God told him to do something doesn't mean that God actually commanded such an act. We read, for example, in John 16, where Jesus says that people are going to do all sorts of evils in the name of God. Well, that doesn't mean that God actually told them to do something.
Right.
And so Jesus says in Matthew 7 at the judgment that many will say to me, Lord, didn't we cast out demons or prophesy or do miracles in your name? And Jesus will say, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. So a lot of things can be done by in the name of Jesus, in the name of God, by evildoers, and it's not as though this is being endorsed by God at all. Now, of course, if an act is commanded by God, then one ought to do it. But let's ask the question: what are the qualifications for this terrorist who says God told him to blow up a bus full of children? For one thing, and wonders that we see surrounding the commands to with regard to the Canaanites, parting the Red Sea, the plagues in Egypt, the manna in the wilderness, the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night, and so forth. These are public signs that are very evident and that give credence to the claim that God said to drive out the Canaanites. But what does the terrorist have in that regard? Nothing. He doesn't have those kinds of signs.
Sure.
Has this, allegedly private revelation that God told him to do this, or Muhammad, who himself had private revelations, was commanding these sorts of things. But this is different. We have public signs and wonders here. Furthermore, what are the prophetic credentials that this person has? I mean, are they? We look at Moses, who spoke to God face to face, that these signs and wonders accompanied him. And also we see that there is, in Matthew chapter 7, that you can know a true prophet by the kind of fruits that come from his life, that you will know them by their fruits. And this is in the context of true and false prophets. Well, a person is going to, if he's going to be a true prophet, there's going to be a reflection of a good moral character that is there. If this terrorist is saying God told me to do this, but his life is characterized by killing innocent people, by deception, by breaking promises, and so forth, well, that person doesn't have the qualifications of a prophet in terms of his own character.
Sure.
His character is to characterize the prophet. So is this person living a morally virtuous life? Is this person engaged in moral virtue? If he's not, then he's not going to be morally trustworthy when it comes to God told me to do this. What we have in the scriptures is an exception to what is generally understood, and this is seen as only for a specific time, for a specific people, and it is even not for all of those people. It's just for those who refuse to repent, those who refuse to engage in those sorts of activities that would be considered criminal acts in any civilized society. So we're dealing with different scenarios here, and hopefully some of these things that I've unpacked will help us to better see the biblical nuances as well as the philosophical qualifications and nuances as well as we approach this question.
So I've got a lot of ground to cover, and I've been taking notes here because I've got some follow-up questions for you. So you brought up, what if today someone says the same thing? Oh, well, God told me to do it. Well, you've brought up the fact that, this is perhaps just a supposed private revelation, but with Israel we have public revelations. We have signs and wonders. We have prophets and whatnot. Now you said something about the prophet being credible, right? Maybe he doesn't live a morally upstanding lifestyle. But wouldn't maybe someone say that the same about the Israelites here, that they're killing women and children, and so really they aren't credible either, so we shouldn't believe them?
Well, the issue here is this something that is exceptional, or is this standard fare? This is exceptional for the terrorist. It's standard fare to kill non-combatants and so forth. And again, this goes even beyond the qualifications of just the very strange language that the scriptures give, where you have on the one hand utterly language that which also presupposes that people are still going to be around and not to make treaties with them, or that there are lots of survivors, but yet we're told that they've been utterly destroyed. So there is this, there are a lot of layers to unpack here, and it's just, if you try to, in a sense, systematize it, it's going to be very, very confusing, if you will. And if you want to take these things literally, it's going to be contradictory. So we need to take a number of different, shades of what the scriptures are talking about to put the picture together. But anyway, back to this question of, isn't this, aren't the Israelites engaging in the very thing that you're saying, kind of calls into question the character of these people? Well, think about Joshua. Think about Moses. You think about Moses being someone who is, here there's such a virtue that he is being portrayed as someone who wants Israel to survive despite their wickedness, that he is showing patience and so forth. And God's saying, well, look, I can wipe them out and start over with you. And Moses is pleading on behalf of the people. So you see that there is even, with Moses, who you think would be, ready to just have done with them. He is one who is actually intervening on their behalf and wanting God to be understood as faithful to his promises, that the perceptions of the people around, here did God bring them out of the wilderness just to destroy them, and he didn't fulfill the promises and so forth. No, God, you've got to bring them through. You've got to come through and so forth. There's this kind of dynamic conversation going on between Moses and God, and you do see that there is a moral uprightness to Moses, that there is an integrity to Moses and Joshua as well. That there is that, and again we're talking about the general qualifications, that there is a general moral character here, but there may be certain exceptions to the rule.
The norm, yeah.
I'm someone who, I don't want to kill anyone. I don't want to bring harm to anyone, but I would protect and defend my family if there were some sort of a home invasion. I would want to defend, lethally if necessary, from my loved ones who are in my charge from this kind of attack, assault, injury, from death itself. So again, I love peace. I don't want to get into this sort of a thing, but if I'm called to do this sort of a thing, well, I want to step up and do what's right in that sort of a circumstance.
Yeah.
So anyway, all that to say is we're dealing with something that is exceptional. It is, and even in Deuteronomy 20 itself, where you have this language of utter destruction and so forth, we also see that this is an exception to the ordinary laws of warfare that are taking place here, that you distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and so forth, that this is something that is an unusual set of circumstances, and it's an unusually wicked people that we're dealing with here, that they have sunk to this low level, that they're engaging in infant sacrifice and so forth, and that the time has come for God to bring judgment upon them. He has waited over half a millennium for this time. So you have a number of these sorts of qualifications that add, again, more layers to this whole issue.
Yeah. Now, I want to follow up with a question about, well, yes, it was very sinful, but doesn't it seem kind of extreme to command that the Israelites kill the women and the children? But before we follow up on that, I want to just cover one point, because I get the feeling that we're going to talk more about that hyperbolic language after the break. But before we go to the break, so we have these leftover survivors, right? We have people that are still living there. Wouldn't it be possible that, maybe the Israelites just failed to fulfill God's command? I mean, and so even though, God did command to kill all the women and the children, but the Israelites didn't do that. So how do we understand that?
Well, a few things here. And again, Matthew Flanagan and I talk about some of these things in our book, that God desires, he desires to show mercy rather than to bring judgment. So if people refuse to repent, that's a last resort. We need to see this as a last resort situation, but it's not as though it's closed off from people actually embracing the one true God, or leaving the land, or repenting from their ways and so forth. That adds another category to the situation that we're talking about. So I would say, when it comes to the whole issue of the Canaanites, just think about in chapter 8 of the book of Joshua. At the end of the book, you have these people who are dwelling in the town of Shechem, between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Joshua is reading this covenant, the book of Deuteronomy. He's reading the law, and it's a covenant renewal ceremony. But notice that there are these strangers there from the town of Shechem who are listening in. They're part of this covenant renewal ceremony. Where did they come from? Very interesting that there is an incorporation of these Canaanites into the people of God, into their the reading of the law and so forth, without batting an eye. So you have this willingness on the part of God to embrace those who repent, to those who turn and so forth, that God doesn't desire the death of the wicked. We need to understand that he would rather see, for example, in the book of Ezekiel, God would rather see the Israelites turn from their wicked ways and live. And God says, "Why will you die, O house of Israel?" So we ought to see God as one who is reluctant to judge, that God desires to see salvation. Think of the book of Jonah. Mm-hmm. Jonah is one who is upset because God has spared the Assyrians, the Ninevites, and he says, "I knew that this would happen because you're a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness." Something we read out of Exodus 34, where God. But it also says God will not leave the guilty unpunished in that same text. So God desires to show mercy. God is willing to relent, as Jeremiah 18 says that God, if there is any nation, he's not just talking about Israel. It says, if that nation against whom God has pronounced judgment turns from its wicked ways, then God will relent from the judgment he had threatened against it. So we see that this is part of God's general dealings with the nations, not just Israel, and this would certainly apply to the Canaanites as well. But the fact that they are hardened, they are resistant, many of them, that they are entrenched, and really not caring about those signs and wonders that are accompanying the Israelites as they're coming into the land, just shows how hardened and resistant they are, and that judgment is coming upon a people who are ripe for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this has been great, but we've got to take a short break. So let's continue the discussion after this break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
This show is sponsored in part by Fox Restoration Incorporated, specializing in roofing, siding, gutters, windows, and remodeling of all types in the western suburbs of Chicago. Fox Restoration is locally owned, licensed, insured, and Better Business Bureau A+ rated. For more information or to schedule a free no-obligation consultation, visit www.foxrestorationinc.com or call 888-269-5113.
Join former presidential candidate and retired U.S. Representative Michelle Bachmann at the Illinois Family Institute Faith, Family, and Freedom Banquet, September 30th at the Stonegate at Hoffman Estates.
It is in God that we as a nation put our trust.
Michelle Bachmann and the Faith, Family, and Freedom Banquet. Order tickets at IllinoisFamily.org.
No government gave me rights that only God can give.
Order tickets today at IllinoisFamily.org or call 708-781-9328. Underwritten by Illinois Family Institute.
Well, thanks for sticking with us, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Copan, and today we're discussing the supposed genocide commands in the Old Testament, and I guess issues related to that, to the war that went on, the type of warfare that went on. But before we get back to that, Dr. Copan, it's time for a segment of the show that we like to call Rapid Questions, and this is a segment in the show where we ask short, lighthearted questions and want fast responses. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. What film did you see last?
Blacklist.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Taco Bell.
What's your favorite sport?
Soccer.
What's your number one pet peeve?
I don't think I have one.
All right, morning or night person?
Morning person.
Lefty or righty?
Righty.
What's your favorite cuisine?
Indian.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No.
What's your inner milkshake flavor?
Chocolate.
Crushed ice or cubed ice?
Crushed.
Spring or fall?
Fall.
What fruit would you say your head is shaped like?
Gosh.
It's a hard one.
I don't know. Orange. I don't know.
Okay, where would you like to live?
New England.
New England. Okay, all right. Where in New England specifically?
Connecticut.
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Nice. Great. Well, thank you so much for playing Rapid Questions. Okay, so before we took the break, you gave us essentially what was a great introduction of the issues at stake here. You talked about how yes, there's this warfare language, but the war that's going on, the warfare that's going on is local, and so it's not sort of worldwide. It's just for a specific geographic location. And the issues for going to war are largely based on sin and wickedness, and we're not just talking what today we might call non-essentials like tattoos or which day you pick as the Sabbath or something like that, but rather that people are sacrificing their children to false gods. They're having sexual relations with animals. And so this is a really wicked communities, and they sort of, it needs to be not ethnically cleansed, but behaviorally cleansed, right? It needs to become holy again. The land needs to become holy. And so this isn't just a short, all of a sudden, the Israelites decided this. This was a long-term goal, a long-term plan, and it was made known publicly. Even the Canaanites had heard about the work that Yahweh was doing, and so they better have been prepared that he was coming. Okay, now there is this language, though, about utterly destroying, and then even that may not be as off-putting, but it's what is utterly destroyed. All of the animals, the women, and the children. And so in the first half of the show, you gave some examples where we might find ourselves taking innocent life, such as ectopic pregnancies or a plane that's been hijacked by terrorists, taking that, a president might say, well, take it out of the sky to prevent more deaths. But do those examples really equate? I think I'd agree that those are instances where innocent life is being taken. But But why does the innocent life need to be taken out of the land of Canaan? I mean, these are just little babies, right, that are out of the womb. Why do they need to be taken? What purpose would that serve?
Well, again, in laws that are given, we may not know what is actually behind everything. What purpose would it serve? We aren't necessarily told what is what purpose it would serve. We're simply told that this is the extent to which you are to go. But again, as I said, even in these sorts of warfare situations, for one thing, even though men, women, young, old, and so forth, all of these categories are mentioned, we're not told, for example, that
they did kill women
and children are involved here. Like, for example, in the Israelites were going to be fighting against the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, and there was this citadel city. And what's interesting is, you've just heard about, man, woman, young, and old, and so forth, utterly destroy them. And then you have Saul going to this, basically sending messengers into the city to the Kenites who are there, and he says, "We don't have any beef with you." By the way, the Kenites were mentioned in Genesis 15 with Abraham. That these are the peoples that you're going to go into, whose land you're going to go. But Saul says, "We don't have any issue with you," and so the Kenite warriors basically leave, and so they're just fighting against the Amalekites. Now, do you think that women and children are going to be in that sort of a situation? First, they're giving warning that we're going to battle against the Amalekites. But then Saul goes on to say, along with the narrator, both of them are affirming that, that Saul did exactly what the Lord commanded when it came to killing the Amalekites. Of course, he kept animals to himself and kept King Agag alive. But he had said he had done what the Lord had commanded, and the narrator affirms that he had done so. So we're left with, again, this interesting language of even when women and children are mentioned, are they even involved? So you have that, again, nuanced language as well.
Right.
You also have, remember too, that you have also King Agag, again, a wicked king. Samuel says that he has left many women childless, and so his mother would be left childless when King Agag would be killed by Samuel. So we're not talking about really nice people. They themselves are doing the kinds of things, they're killing people too. And there's this kind of law of, that God is going to bring justice to people. If you do these sorts of things to others, these things will be done to you. So there is that kind of a component as well that we could also add into the picture. But again, if God is an all-wise, all-knowing God, and he issues a command that may be, add a certain moral tension or add a certain moral question to our categories, God is the one who would best know what command ought to be issued in this circumstance. So it's not up to even a human being. This is God who is speaking, who is issuing this command. And it's not as though God is commanding something that is intrinsically evil. We've seen that there may be morally justifiable reasons for taking innocent human life. Well, in this case, is it possible that God might have morally justifiable reasons for doing so, even though we may not know what those reasons are? And I would say, well, yes. And we also would say that based on what we see in Scripture, what we know of goodness itself, the character of God, that there are some things that God will not command, that God will not do. So, for example, in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 19, there is the ritual sacrifice of children. And God says that he didn't command it, neither did it even enter his mind. In other words, this is so foreign to God's goodness that it's as though he wouldn't even dream this up. He wouldn't even think of it. He didn't even know this was coming. And that's the kind of language that's being used to show how God is removed from wickedness. And so God is not one who is going to command something that is intrinsically evil, though he may command something that is morally difficult.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a couple questions here that people have submitted, and I want to sort of make sure I can address those. So here's one question. So this question comes from David. And so he asks, if genocide did not occur, what exactly did occur in your opinion? Do you believe that the Israelite armies killed non-combatants intentionally? And do you believe they carried away war brides in our context / raped them? So essentially he says here, he continues, if you think that the language is hyperbolic and that genocide did not occur, what did occur? And it seems like it's still connected to a command by God. So, I mean, here, Paul, you've given a little bit of a clue in here that, well, yes, God is in a position still to command his people to go to war over these issues. But how would you respond there? Especially, so we haven't talked yet about what happened to the women as war brides.
Right.
Maybe you could address that.
Sure. First, I think we get a clue as to what is meant by utter destruction when we look at what God himself says that he is going to do to the nation of Judah in Jeremiah 25, verses 9 through 11, where God says he is going to utterly destroy Judah and leave its cities in everlasting desolation through Babylon. So, did that literally happen? Well, no. You keep reading throughout the book of Jeremiah, you read other biblical books, and you see that there are a lot of survivors who are in the land. A number of people, the urban elite from Jerusalem, are taken off to Babylon. But you have the nation of Judah, you have a lot of Judahites who are still around. So it is not, they have not been utterly destroyed in any literalistic sense. But if you understand the ancient Near East, you say, yeah, okay, well, this makes sense. I would say that there has been a disabling that has taken place. Yes, there has been death, that there has been a disabling of the religious, the political, the military, the economic, the social fabric of the nation of Judah, that it has been incapacitated. And that is the sort of thing that we see, even that word utterly destroy, applied to in the book of Jeremiah itself. So even those as Kenneth Kitchen said, that language of disabling raids is helpful when we understand what is going on in the book of Joshua. Mm-hmm. That they're going back to their base camp, they're disabling, they're incapacitating, right. And then they're moving back to their base camp without taking over, without wreaking, this military blitzkrieg and taking over vast swaths of territory all at once. It's more gradualistic. It's slow. It's a process. It takes a couple of hundred years before Yahweh becomes the established name in Israel, etc. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Secondly, what about those who are prisoners of war? Well, there were rules about how you got a bride, and there had to be a kind of transition process. You were not allowed to rape. Rape was not permitted. There was no sexual contact permitted outside of marriage. I mean, that was just part of the fabric of the Israelite community. And so as you read the Old Testament text, you see that adultery is prohibited. Rape is not at all permitted. In fact, there are laws against rape. That this could bring even the death penalty for you if you engaged in rape. Secondly, if you had a foreign bride, say a prisoner of war, there'd have to be a ceremony that would take place in which she would shave her head, the woman would shave her head, clip her nails and so forth, and it would be kind of a mourning process to say goodbye to her old way of life, and now to be incorporated into Israel in a new way of life, a new, living under the, living under the law of Moses, living with a new people and so forth. So there's this farewell to an old way of life and to a new way of life. And that if a man decided not to marry her in the end, she had to be treated with dignity rather than being treated as some sort of an object or whatever. Mm-hmm. So you have certain protocols that have to be followed. It's not, you do have, yes, rape that takes place in a lot of ancient Near Eastern settings. That is just kind of stock warfare tactics, but not with the land of Israel. That was prohibited by the law of Moses itself. This was, yes, they could take women as their own wives, but you had to be married first in order to engage in sexual relationships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got this language here, this hyperbolic language, and so we've got some other questions here about that. I'm just going to try and synthesize some of them. So, why is it that God would use hyperbolic language with a culture? And then, so there's that question. And then as a follow-up, why would God then use that hyperbolic language when generations later could so easily misunderstand because they're no longer part of that context?
Right. Well, I would say this. It is helpful for us to know the context with which we are dealing. Like in the genre, for example, the type of literature that we're talking about, there are certain rules that you have to understand that enable us to interpret what the author is saying. So if you know that he's speaking with a lot of figurative language, metaphors, symbols, and so forth, like the trees of the field clapping their hands, you don't say, hey, that's, I've never seen a tree clap its hands before. No, we know that that's the type of genre or literature that we're dealing with, and so we don't think that there's something amiss. We also, when it comes to ancient Near Eastern war texts, what we ought to do is actually look at the scriptures more closely, more carefully, because what we'll see when we do so is that there is the language side by side of both utter destruction and plenty of survivors. I think a lot of people say, well, look, the Bible, how much clearer can the Bible be? It says they utterly destroyed them. They left alive nothing that breathes and so forth. Yes, that's only one side of the ledger, though. You need to read the other side of the ledger, too, in order to be consistent. And if you read them both side by side and have an understanding that, oh, maybe more is going on here, you realize, oh, this is part of the, there's something more going on than just kind of a straightforward recounting here. Maybe there is hyperbole here. And indeed, when we read the ancient Near Eastern war text, that is exactly what we see. We see this kind of exaggeration, hyperbole, and so forth when it comes to warfare situations. Now, so on the one hand, I would say, yes, it can be a little confusing when you read just one side of the ledger, but I'd say read the other side of the ledger, and it will become clear. It's not as though, some people say, well, how can we really trust what the Bible is saying? Well, I'm saying we haven't been reading the Bible as carefully as we should, because look at what the rest of the scriptures say. Look at how there are plenty of survivors. What are you going to do with that? Are you just going to ignore it? And I think we basically have ignored that kind of language and just focused on the utterly destroy. So that's what I would encourage people to do. I'm not saying read the Bible more superficially, but I'm saying read it more carefully. And as you read it more carefully, you see that there's a lot of rich texture and nuance here that we shouldn't, and if we take the two sides of the ledger literally, they'll contradict each other.
I've sort of had a question perhaps that's come up in my mind before. When we're dealing with this language of God being hyperbolic, couldn't it just be the case that the Israelites perceived their deity to be stating using stock warfare rhetoric? I mean, did God audibly speak these things, or was this merely the Israelites' perception? How should we understand that?
Well, we do have God speaking through prophets, Moses, Joshua, and so forth. That there are certain things that they go before the Lord and they're inquiring of the Lord, and the Lord says, "Do this" or "Don't do that." That there are certain protocols that they follow. They have prophets and so forth who are in their midst, who are also advising kings about warfare situations, etc. So it's you do have certain not to mention the accompaniment of these signs and wonders that add credibility to the those who are speaking. So yes, we don't know all the ins and outs, but there is a difference between merely Moses at a burning bush and are taking his word for it, then from say a situation in which there's a Red Sea that opens before you, or there is a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, or manna every morning in the wilderness, etc. So there are so there is a kind of an integrated fabric. That there are these things that all kind of fit together. It's not as though you can always separate the private message or what was the nature of the message from the public signs. You see these things as coming together as part of God's vindication, of God's approval of a messenger whom he has sent to deliver a particular command to the people that ought to be carried out. So again, we can maybe look at some of the details and say, wonder how this works, but I think the main thrust is that these are messengers who are selected by God, who have a particular role to play, a very dominant role to play in Israelite society, and directing them with regard to the nations around them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my last question for you is this: so if here in the war annals of Israelites' history we have a hyperbolic explanation, what's keeping us from saying that there are other passages in the Bible that are figurative or hyperbolic themselves, and seemingly that would get us out of, sort of like a get out of jail free card, right, with difficult texts?
Yeah. Well, this doesn't prevent us from the need for doing homework. We still need to do our homework and examine texts and to see what is the best reading. Did the author intend this to be literal? Did he intend it to be figurative? And I said, even within the text that I've been citing of Joshua and Judges, we see very clearly that there is hyperbole involved. That as you compare texts, you see that that if you take them both literally, they will cancel each other out. They will contradict each other. We don't see that, for example, when it comes to the resurrection. Do we see that Jesus rose from the dead, but that his body was somehow in the tomb? No, we see uniform witness against that sort of a thing. Again, we have rules and regulations, as it were, if you will, with regard to the genres or types of literature within Scripture. Mm-hmm. There are things like the book of Revelation, a highly symbolic book. It's part of the apocalyptic genre, especially in chapters 4 through middle of 22. We have high degrees of symbolism. Numbers have symbolic value. Colors, even the beasts and so forth. These are symbolic. And we basically invert principles of interpretation, whereas in historical narrative, we typically understand something as being literal unless there are good reasons for taking it figuratively. But in the book of Revelation, in this apocalyptic section, we assume that something is symbolic unless we have good reasons for taking it literally. So there will just be different rules that apply to how we interpret the scriptures. And there are admittedly some places where things are a little bit more, unclear and ambiguous. But what we ought to do is start with the clear and move to the unclear rather than starting with the ambiguous text and saying, oh, therefore it's all up for grabs.
Mm-hmm. Great. Hey, Dr. Copan, thanks for your thoughts on this matter. Thank you for the research that you've done, helping to shed light on the difficult war passages, the supposed divine genocide commands in the Old Testament that we see. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you, Kurt. God bless you.
Okay, so that was Dr. Paul Copan, and again, a special thanks out to him for taking time out of his schedule to answer some of these difficult questions that we have. Chris, I'd love to get your thoughts on the matter, but before we do that, we've got a patient caller. Eric has been waiting on the line, and he wants to discuss the Canaanites' responsibility in the war that God was putting them back on. So, Eric, what's your comment or question?
Well, it's kind of a little of both. I think we're starting off with the wrong presuppositions. I think we need to start with absolute morality to fully understand what God is doing. I think there's a couple of conflicts with what's being said. Like, number one, the kingdoms themselves that were the Canaanites were kingdoms. When they say utterly destroyed, the Hebrew word karem literally means utterly destroyed. It's an action on top of the word destroyed, meaning to make it utterly destroyed. And we're talking about the nation, not the individual. Like he said before, individuals left. They seen the trouble coming and they left. Go back to Rahab. She said that they heard about the Jews coming and their hearts melted at the very thought of them coming. And like he said before, we've got people here who are murdering each other, having sexual rituals, and then murdering their babies with drums and fires and such. These people were not only at war with God, but would immediately been at war with the people of Israel once they entered the land. And so in reality, this wasn't, the Jews going to war with people. This was God going to war with people, and the Jews being the tool that is used. And much in the same way that Babylon was used to entreat the Jews when they weren't behaving.
Sure.
To go even a step further, I would question his example about shooting down the plane or even the fallopian tube thing. Because, for one, you beg the question, why don't I seek God first? Because he does do miracles. He is the miracle worker. And number two, how can you dismiss the individual's life and trade for the many? I mean, that goes back to, the few bring the many.
Yeah. Okay, so
I think we're going from the wrong precepts,
So what you're saying here, that one of the first points that you had was that the utter destruction is of the nation, right? To make sure that the social structures of that geographic region were to be destroyed. And if I'm understanding you correctly...
In a more literal sense, a kingdom of Satan being destroyed in the land of Canaanite.
Well, yeah, so if you're just talking about the social structures, then yeah, I think that's perfectly compatible with what Dr. Copan's saying here. And it doesn't necessarily entail that the women and the children are being killed. And I think that's, from an apologetic standpoint, that's one of the crucial aspects, because this is why some of the people are repulsed by the text and therefore by the Bible and Christianity. It's because, how could God command the Israelites to kill the women and the children? So as far as I'm concerned, yeah, so your main point there, I think is...
Well, I mean, I could even go back a step further with the precepts of morality and say, well, if I don't believe in absolute morality from God, who cares about the women and children? They're just a bunch of animals, Who cares about me at that rate? I mean, there's no purpose outside of God. I mean, you have to base your morality on absolute morality, which is God's character.
Yeah, that's...
When he makes an exact judgment of righteousness, when he judges a sinful nation, is he wrong in his judgment? Or is he committing an act of righteousness by judging evil doing?
Yeah, and that's a different...
I mean, look at Sodom and Gomorrah. He had a specific act of war against Sodom and Gomorrah that he committed himself.
Right. Yeah, no. So what you're taking is it's a certain methodology which may be acceptable. So this is just another route that one can take.
Well, I'd even go a step further. Not all the people in the land of Canaanite were human. We had Nephilim in those days. As Joshua's spies came back, it says there's giants in the land. I mean, Goliath himself was a Nephilim.
Yeah, well, so now hang on a second. So you'd have to, if you think there are giants, you might have to think, well, I'd ask for evidence that those giants are not human.
I'm bringing up a big topic, but just assuming for a moment that that's true, then they're not entirely fighting just human people.
Well, that could be, and you might even think that there's spiritual warfare going on at the same time, which we don't have.
I wouldn't be surprised. I would also say that Saul, when he kept King Agag and stuff, no, he was rebuked for doing so. He had gotten the sheep so that he could give them as a sacrifice, and even Moses himself, if it was Moses, it could have been, no, it was David, I think it was, said to him, obedience is better than sacrifice. He was told to kill it all, not take it back, not take it with him.
Yeah, we'd have to get into the text, and unfortunately we don't have time to get into the text today, but we'll bring it up again. The point I want to make to that, though, is in 1 Samuel 15, since I've got it up here, and I read it earlier on the show. So it says, "But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fattened calves and the lambs." And here's the next phrase that's important. "And all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them."
Good, but you got to realize he was about to sacrifice these molested sheep.
Were those things good? And if we take a certain interpretation,
more importantly, what was he told to do?
Yeah, well, remember,
was he not told to slaughter the sheep?
Yeah, well, we have to be careful not to be begging the question here, because what does it mean to utterly destroy? What does it apply to? Is it hyperbolic?
Well,
or is
according to the word that's used in Hebrew is kal ram, and it's an addition to the word.
Well, look, we need to make sure we're not doing we need to make sure we're not committing the root fallacy here. I mean, even if you asked me if the Cubs beat the Cardinals yesterday, and I said, "Oh, they slaughtered them," right? What that means is not that the Cubs players actually killed the Cardinals players at Wrigley Field. What it means is that they just beat them really badly in the game. I think they won 5-0 or something, which isn't maybe a baseball slaughter. At any rate, the point is this.
I need to get into my tots and tittles to be sure how effective this word is, but I mean, there's a lot of words that it's used for, like forfeit, devote, destroy, to be blunt, have a flat nose.
So we need to make sure we're not. Words do have meaning, and we need to try our best to understand what the meaning is. So.
Well, that's like saying, does the Greek word all mean all? Yeah, it means all.
Well, sometimes it means generally. Sometimes it doesn't mean exhaustively. Every
it's a different word, because in the language of Greek, you have different word additions that make specific meanings, and they have to have certain requirements. Some requirements very implicitly tell what kind of timeline, if it's past, present, future, or if it's future tense plus future.
Sure.
Present, I mean. Then you have
the scope of
male
the word.
And female connotations. You have dominant and submissive connotations. I mean, these are additions that are required verbiage for a specific word to even be used.
Right. Okay. But there are still scopes to the definitions. And so we just need to understand and try our best to interpret what the scope is of a word in any given context. So, and that's the key thing here today.
And I think my whole problem here is that we're making it look like this was man's actions against possibly great men, but at the same time, that's not what's going on here. This is God's actions against evil men with the Jews in the middle, as the tool. And then we're taking that and turning around saying, well, I guess we could shoot down planes with innocent people in them. And maybe abortion's right in some terms. And it's not. It's murder. Well, and you can't disqualify the individual for a group of individuals,
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point.
If I said a group of individuals with 3 or 4 people in one room, and I set a group of one person in another room, and I told you had to choose which one died, what would you choose?
Yeah,
I would beg the question whether or not you should have to
Eric,
choose.
you brought a lot up here, and I want to thank you for your comment on the show today. So I'll go ahead and answer this. So in the hypothetical you've given me, there has to be a good reason, I think, for your instruction. Now, to the point you made about the ectopic...
Just assume the
hang on, let me...
of the contrary, that, you don't have a choice in the matter. You have to make a choice.
Okay, well, I disagree with the premise of your question.
It's an example.
Well, I still disagree with that premise. Let me answer since I know...
you have to shoot down the plane or not shoot down the plane. Do you shoot the plane down?
Yeah, well, if terrorists have taken it over and they're going to fly into buildings in New York City and kill thousands of people, then yes, there's a greater good...
F-15s to force it to go in a different direction.
There's a greater good at stake.
We can't drain its fuel.
Now let me talk about
put somebody on the plane.
Let me talk about the ectopic pregnancy, and then we'll end there. I personally know people where they've had complications from pregnancy, and the egg does not attach, and so then what then? Do we let the fetus grow and then literally it will kill the mother? And so in that case, I think that it is...
In that case, I kind of agree with you. Not in
well,
the sense
then
that
look, innocent life can be taken. Innocent life can be taken. So at any rate, so that was, Eric, I want to thank you for your call. And I just want to say that's Copan's...
Well, before you cut me off, I'm just saying that, we could look at that abortion thing, but that's a whole lot of a tougher,
I agree. You're making a great
simpler example where there are possibilities.
No, you are making a great point, and
I would even say, why can't you put the egg in either another mother or even in that mother's womb? I would question that.
Well,
because again, we're not looking at all the facts. That's a harder topic to take on than say, do you shoot down the plane?
Eric, thanks for your comment today. So,
thank you.
So to that, let me say I did follow up with Dr. Copan because I could see what he was doing. He was bringing up one example, right? And then for those listening, I asked and I followed up later, well, does that seem to be a good enough analogy? Is it a good enough example? Because there are more difficult cases where it seems like, boy, this doesn't really apply. It's not the same thing. It's apples and oranges. So that was a question I had for him. And so you can listen to the follow-up there. If you're interested in more resources, there's a lot out there on this. If you want to check out Dr. Copan's book, it's Did God Really Command Genocide, co-authored with Matthew Flanagan, and he's also written Is God a Moral Monster? And also you're getting into on that issue in particular about if God literally commanded them to do it. You're getting into what's called skeptical theism. Maybe we don't have good enough reasons to know why God commands something, even if we don't like it. Now, that's if you take the command literally. And I don't. I think it's hyperbolic in nature. It's just like how I mentioned, the Cubs slaughtered the Cardinals. This is ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. And so when we do a historical study, we can see that other countries do the same thing. They embellish their war narrative. And part of that is to instill fear in their enemies and to just boast about their accomplishments. And even as Copan said, when you do the historical study, you see even countries and nations that lose in war still talk about how they utterly destroyed their opponents and whatnot. And so this is look, we do it today in politics, right? You see America first, right? Which is this phrase, because it lacks nuance, implies that America can never do any wrong. You see it with other countries that, they just embellish and inflate their accomplishments. And so this is what is happening back then. And when you look at the text like that, it really opens it up to I think the truth of and accuracy of the historical context. And that's really important because we do not want to be importing 21st century bias into the text because it wasn't written to us, it was written for us. Okay, so we're going over our normal time here, but Chris, I saw you taking copious notes. I want to know, what's your first impression on this? This is something you've been thinking about a little bit recently, and so maybe this is a view that you hadn't encountered beforehand. So what'd you think?
I thought it was, well, okay, I have a lot of thoughts on this. But first, I want to thank Brother Eric. I want to thank you for your questions and comments today. I think I agree with a lot of what you said about, it's important that we make sure that we have context of what's going on. Who's commanding this? Is it people against people making arbitrary decisions, or is it God commanding certain things, even if it's either literal or figurative, or et cetera, et cetera. But thank you, Eric, for your questions. I appreciate also Dr. Copan's just a brilliant amount of, I guess, research and historical insight on this, and that he's able to kind of bring a lot of clarity to some of us who may have been wondering, like, hey, did this literally happen? Did God say this thing, or did it? Was it not figurative, but kind of like you've been saying? There's a word for it.
Hyperbolic.
Thank you, hyperbolic words. Do this mostly, but do it in a way that instills what needs to be done.
And for those that aren't too familiar with sort of hyperbole, a lot of scholars think when Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, or if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. That is what's called hyperbole. Jesus doesn't literally mean do it. But he's illustrating the extent to which the issue at stake. So at any rate, but go ahead, continue, Chris.
Yeah. So I think the issue that not the issue I had, but the thoughts I had in this, he addressed a lot of the language and the syntax of what might literally be happening, but it skirted around the issue that I was interested in about, maybe God did command them to do it, or maybe he didn't command them to do it. But the question I had in my mind was, could he have commanded them to do it and he'd still be God? Because if you think about, there's a lot of psychological things from the people who would be asking this, including myself, and then outsiders as well.
Right.
Like, people who ask this, like if we were to give them this explanation, this long explanation that Dr. Copan had given, which sounds correct, and I was reading through the text he was referencing, and I'm like, I think he knows his stuff. Obviously, he's got the creds for it. But then people will be like, oh, okay, that wasn't. Then this now image fits the God I've constructed in my head. And then later, when we talk about things like why is there evil in the world, or how could a loving God send to hell, then these issues come back up because we haven't really dealt with the issue. We've crafted a God that people are very comfortable with. Like, oh, okay, well, God wouldn't command genocide. Well, he might. There are issues in which he might. So the thing that normally happens, I guess, to encourage my brothers and sisters who get attacked by this, like they'll have friends or coworkers or intellectuals come at them with this and they don't know how to answer it, is that many times intellectuals will they'll take a book, a Deuteronomy, and that's their cross section of who God is, and they'll say, here's this God that I don't like, and then they expect your answer to be a form of Christianity fit for a 5-year-old. And anything outside of that is just, it's not acceptable.
Well, no, and that's a good that's a good thing you have in mind there. You want to make sure that we aren't just dealing with sort of this basic, simplistic theological worldview. Let me put it that way. I don't want to say simplistic faith because Jesus talks about having childlike faith, but it's a simplistic theological worldview. And so it's good to be concerned about that. And you do have a good question. Well, could God command those things? So first, let me say, I want to know, what did God command and what did he mean? Yeah. But then when we ask ourselves, and in that sense, it's both a historical and yet philosophical inquiry. But when we ask, could God command that? That's sort of like another higher level. What could God do? Whereas, and that doesn't so much concern us with what the text actually says. Yeah. So I think when we stick with the text, yes, there are those difficult passages, but again, something that Dr. Copan pointed out, there are also these other verses that are associated with them that we need to pay attention to about how there are survivors and such.
Oh, yeah.
And so, well, okay, what exactly is going on here? Now, some people think, well, maybe that's because they failed in their duties. And this was one of the questions I had asked him to respond to. So, and I just don't think that objection is sufficient enough, because it does seem like, no, there are good things about this, and God does honor the people, and even there are treaties which God does honor. So there's a lot of issues here. Well, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like if you look at this, I think the thing that's important about looking at could he have commanded this, or how did it play out, is like I said, even if those issues get addressed, they carry over into other problems like problem of pain.
Yeah.
That you have that individual who's asking the question, still wrestling with who is God's character, and if you don't address it then it's hard to address it later. You have to address the same things over and over again if you don't. About it. But
true,
if you think about, like, it seems like if you look at this from if you just kind of wipe away all the syntax and look at this, and like, this seems like a really weird way for God to make space for a people to live. So you have to, if you look at this just in this context as an outsider, then I agree with you, outsider, looking at this. Like, God does appear to be unmerciful. God does appear to be vindictive, but we have the Christian God who's being uphold it as, hey, he's a merciful, loving God. So we have to find a way to reconcile those two things. And to, like everything else with God and moral complexities, you have to pull back to a wide shot of what God might see.
Yeah.
And this whole thing that you see in Deuteronomy, Joshua, during this time that they're trying to occupy this land,
right,
started 500 years ago.
Yeah, well, and Paul and Dr. Copan makes that point.
Yeah.
Remember, he says you got to look back to Genesis because it's about God's promises to Abraham, and it's about the sin that they're doing, but the time is not yet fulfilled. So it's sort of like I know Dr. John Walton, who's a professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, and we haven't had him on the show yet, but hopefully we will. He's talked about maybe, Chris, at one of the conferences you've been to, that in the Old Testament, what we see is we see the scales of justice. And so when you have that in mind, the passage about how their sin is not yet fulfilled, it's not like they've weighted down the scale yet. I mean, so if it gets down to a certain point, okay, time for justice and punishment because, you need to be spiritually cleansed because it's such a depraved society.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to reconcile these things with, I guess, with God's character of who he is, and seeing, like, you need to be able to wide shot. And I would ask this for anyone who fairly argues this, is wide shot, if there was an omnipotent, omniscient being, would he command this, or what reasons could he have? And we see that in Genesis, when he he promises this 500 years before it happens.
Right.
There are people other than Abraham's offspring who knew what God was, because Abraham met them all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And so all these people who God all of a sudden appears to suddenly say, you know what, kill them. They had 500 years to change, and God knew how long it would take them.
Well, and they heard of Yahweh's actions too, like Copan mentioned. So
everyone knew who he was, so he was very merciful. And even here's the thing too that we see in part of God's character is that he hates evil regardless, and this is the same God we still serve. He's loving and merciful, and he's given us all a way to atone for that and be in relationship with him. Yeah, the guy still hates evil, and he's still the same God. Yeah. And it can sometimes be hard to reconcile that perspective. But if you think about this in Isaiah, when God's talking to his people, he says, hey, I love you, and I've ransomed entire nations just so you would understand who I am and we can be in relationship. And anyone who's ever had a loved one, knows how much they would pay to be in relationship with this loved one and for them to know certain things. And God says, hey, I love all these people, but I've given them in ransom for you. And then as far as God's glory is concerned, in places like Job and Romans, God will say, hey, I'm God. Who are you? What have you made that is not mine already? What do I have to owe? What do I owe you, man? Can you render to me an answer? There are things we expect from God because of his character, but he says, realistically, I don't owe you anything. And if you want to cite human rights, well, what human rights do you have apart from the ones that God has? No. And so God is free to, God may say, and this is, Paul actually brings this up in Romans because he had people who were legitimately thinking about this. It's well, what am I supposed to do if God can do this? Well, God has reasons for doing it that he can see. He can see that, hey, there's these people who want redemption, but the only way they're going to be able to do it is if I glorify it, if I show what wrath is, and I have to use people I've created to do that as instruments. For that.
Those are some good thoughts. Yeah. And for those that are interested more and want to look into that, There's material out there. So a lot of what Chris is talking about is called, I've mentioned, the skeptical theism, this camp that, well, we're just not in this position. I did have a few things there that I might push back on a little bit, sure. not all that much, but unfortunately we don't have time today to do that. But maybe, I'm sure we'll have another episode maybe devoted just to that. So.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks for those thoughts, Chris.
Sure, thank you.
If you're interested more, you want to get Copan's book again. That's titled Did God Really Command Genocide? Coming to Terms with the Justice of God by Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan by Baker Books, published by Baker Books. All right. Well, that does it for our show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnership of our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, and Fox Restoration. And also, before we close here, let me make one brief announcement. So we are going to be doing a giveaway on our Facebook page. We're going to be giving away the book, Good Faith, Being a Christian When Society Thinks You're Irrelevant and Extreme by David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. They are the leaders of Barna and Q. So we're going to be giving that away. So go ahead and like us on social media and follow us, and you'll see that, and you'll get a chance to win for that. So, okay, thank you to the tech team. Chris, especially today, Joel was off. He promises he will be here next week. And again, a special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Paul Copan. Thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.